Welcome to the Narrator Roundtable. I am Kirt Graves. Joining me today are some of my illustrious co-hosts. We have André Santana in the room. Hello, André.
Well, hello, Kirt. Hello.
Hello. Also joining us today from the great city of Chicago is Lindsey Dorcus.
Feeling so illustrious, Kirt.
So illustrious, yes. And perhaps the most illustrious of all of us, joining us from the country of Spain, randomly, is Gail Shalan.
Just wanted to shake it up this week,
just randomly recording at 1 a.m. in Spain, and we couldn't be more happy to have you with us to talk about this today. In the year of our Lord 2024, I think it's safe to say we all know about the legendary drag superstar RuPaul Charles. Drag queens are known for many wonderful things: the looks, the swagger, the activism, the outreach, the shade, and almost always a drag name that can tell you more about who they are, make you laugh, and creates a separation between the person they are walking down the street and the person they develop in front of an audience. Some of my favorite drag names include, but are not limited to, Irma Gerd, Amanda Tory Meeting, Britta Filter, Sigourney Beaver, Pandora Box, the Australian drag queen Courtney Act, Delta Work, and probably my favorite, Karen from Finance.
Yep.
So, do you guys have any faves that you want to throw in?
Sharon Needles.
Sharon Needles. I've heard Lisa Newcar.
Oh, nice.
Love it. Even though that is such a prevalent part of the drag experience, and even though RuPaul Charles is likely the most famous drag artist ever, rising to the heights of an industry in which coming up with a drag name is usually step number one for most artists, RuPaul Charles is not a pseudonym. That is her government name, which can be awkward. As she likes to say, and I am paraphrasing here because she said it in a lot of different iterations, it is uncomfortable when the nurse calls out RuPaul Charles in the waiting room at the gynecologist. So we all happen to work in another industry in which using a pseudonym is common practice. But how common and why? Well, that's what we're here to discuss today at the Narrator Roundtable. And joining us is Lessa Lamb.
Hey, y'all.
So Lessa has been narrating audiobooks since 2014. She works across many genres, but the majority of her work is in romance and erotica, which was a natural move for her after her previous work in sex and relationship coaching. Lessa has always been fascinated with how people speak, and I can personally attest to her ability to be both engrossed and engrossing in conversation. She's also the subject of a wonderful LitHub article in which author Erica Berry describes the process of selecting Lessa as her narrator. And Lessa won an Earphones Award for her work on Berry's book, Wolfish. Welcome to the Narrator Roundtable, Lessa.
Thanks so much. Yeah, Erica's book was amazing.
So I want to get into talking about pseudonyms, and there is a very particular reason that I wanted Lessa to join us for this episode that we will get into. But just to start with, if you're willing to talk about it and you don't have to go into specifics, how many folks in the room have a pseudonym or multiple pseudonyms?
Me? I have one.
I have
a
one pseudonym, just one.
One for Gail, one for André, one for Lessa.
I have one for all intents and purposes.
And one for Lindsey. Do you all also narrate under your own names, though? Yes?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
As well.
I almost exclusively narrate under my own name. I only have a pseudonym for children's work. Because I do so much spicy shit. It's like I had one author come to me, wanted a children's book, and was super excited about me narrating, and I was like, yeah, this is this isn't not YA. It's like children's, like actual
board
children's.
book,
yeah, it's like a chapter book for like grade schoolers. And I'm like, Right. I do not want whoever is listening to this suddenly to be like, oh, yeah, let's see what else Lessa Lamb narrates. I'm super excited, and come up with like strings where the first chapter is like anal and squirting and shit. And I'm like, cool. Yeah, cool. Let's not have that in like an 8-year-old's ears. Let's just not. So I did one book under my pseudonym, LJ May, and that's it. That's all I have under pseudo. Everything else I've ever done, 150 books worth plus, is under my actual name, Lessa Lamb.
So I am I'm the same way because I don't have a pseudonym. I did not know about pseudonyms when it was time to do the first few audiobooks. And by the time I learned you could just type in another name there, it was too late. It was too late.
Way too late.
Yeah. Similar anal squirting, like it was already out there.
Totally.
It was already out in the world.
Already there.
So,
Real.
We also, in preparation for this episode, we put a survey out into the world that we had our fellow narrators answer. We got 150 responses. And we're going to go through some of those stats. These were shared with you guys before the episode. We will also share the results with folks in the show notes if they want to link and see what more of the specific responses are. They can go take a look there. But yeah, let's jump into this. I know for podcast content listeners, this might get a little screwy because we're just going to start throwing some numbers at you. But again, you can check the show notes for the more visual representations of these results. And the reason we did the survey is because I didn't want to assume, like anecdotally, that I understood why narrators have pseudonyms.
Mm-hmm.
I was really curious to find out, first of all, how many of us actually use them, and what the real reasons are. And that's why the survey was anonymous, so that people could be honest about why they choose to have pseudonyms. I will also say, before we jump too far into these numbers, that like if a new narrator were to come to me today and ask, should you use a pseudonym? I would take a page from RuPaul Charles' book and say, yes, use it for everything. Don't put your real name out there at all. Even if you only have one narrator name, just use it for everything. Because otherwise you can have that awkward moment at the gynecologist.
Don't we?
So yeah, as I said, we had 150 responses. We tracked some of their experience and age. Also when they started narrating. I'm just going to highlight a few of those right now. In responding to our poll, we had a pretty even split of how many titles folks had narrated through 4 categories. We tracked 0 through 49 titles, and that was 28%. 50 through 99 titles, that was 20%. 100 through 199 titles, that was 26%. And then over 200 titles was also 26%. So because I was curious if we would see the intake of new narrators that happened in 2020 when the pandemic happened. And boy, did we. 54% of the respondents started beginning in or prior to 2020. So that those years before 2020 and the 2020 years really brought in the bulk of our respondents. And then about 25% started since 2020. So lots of folks started in the 2010s and early 2020. We had almost 75% of our respondents identify as female. About 25 identify as male. But we did have 2 respondents, a little over 1%, that identify as non-binary. We also had the option to prefer not to say, and we did not have anybody click that for this survey. And then age range. The bulk of the folks who responded to this survey were between the ages of 36 and 45. That was 36%-ish. At 34%, we had ages 46 to 55. And then we had 14% 26 to 35, and 8% 56 to 65, and 6-ish% of our 66 plus. We had no one respond to the survey who was 25 or younger. So that's interesting.
I mean, I know it has nothing to do with pseudonyms, but that breakdown alone was so interesting to me, and also like really compelling, and made me feel really hopeful as an actor in this industry, because like I got to tell you, if you did the same survey of like people working in theater, at least when I was working in theater, it would have been like lion's share under 25. Like it was everyone in their early 20s, and then people would start to drop off as you got older. So it was really cool to be like, oh, this is a performing art form where like most of the people involved are like 35 and up, which is really, really exciting to me.
I'll also share about the gender demographic. I'm really interested in like demographics across audiobooks because there isn't really a central space that has those. This is now like the third time I've seen in different spaces a demographic of like hundreds of narrators. And I'm consistently seeing that the vast majority identify as women.
Yeah. And I now want to know what the age range of the characters that are played, particularly in romance, are.
Seriously.
Particularly those who identify as women.
18 to 22.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, that would be fascinating.
Yeah. And being a 43-year-old woman still playing 18 to 22-year-olds is real funny to me.
It's got to be happening, yeah.
It's literally happening. I just did one last week.
We also just asked what are the genres that these people who responded to the questionnaire work in most often. And they could choose more than one thing. And the runaway winner at 74% was romance. And then another 28% checked erotica. So a lot of romance and erotica. Unsurprising in this industry, which produces a lot of romance and erotica. And then after that, coming in somewhere north of 40%, general fiction, nonfiction, mystery thriller, science fiction, fantasy, everything else kind of came in under 40% of the ones we did. So a lot of folks using pseudonyms in romance and erotica. Not surprising, as I suspected that was going to be a large part of what we were discussing. So, who actually uses pseudonyms? In our responses, we actually had 4 different categories. The first was, yes, I sometimes use my real name, but also use at least one pseudonym. 73% of our respondents said that they use a pseudonym and their real name. Another 7-ish% said that they do use a pseudonym and they never use their real name. So those are the people I got to before they started. Because they just use a fake name all the time.
Those are the people who heard that RuPaul story and were like, I got this.
Yeah, exactly. And then we had 14% say that they have never used a pseudonym. So that's me, dummy. And then 6% said they had at one point used a pseudonym, but no longer really use it. So how does that strike you guys? Is that in line with you kind of with what you thought might be true?
I think most of the people that I know in the romance industry specifically are using pseudonyms because of the fact that it's romance.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, I'm not surprised that the majority of people use at least one pseudonym, because I saw this reflected in the survey, and we might get into more of the nitty-gritty of these results as well. But also my own experience, where like part of it is privacy or societal ideas around sex and romance, and but also I think branding is more and more a part of that whole ecosystem as well. So, I just think there's just so many reasons to use a pseudonym. I'm not surprised that a lot of people are in that camp.
Yeah, it certainly feels like of the people I know, like about a similar amount would say they use a pseudonym. So like just anecdotally, my group of narrator friends are probably about that breakdown as well. If not even more people using pseudonyms. It feels very rare to meet somebody else, who doesn't use it for at least a good chunk of their work. So we also asked if they had never used a pseudonym, why? And 92% said they knew that they could use a pseudonym and just chose not to. And then the other 8-ish% were like me, which was that I wasn't aware you could use a pseudonym until it was too late. So
listen, never say never, Kirt.
Yeah. What if so Lindsey brings up a really interesting point about the branding choice, that it's not always genre specific, that you're deciding to apply a different name to your work. Like, I guess maybe we'll get around to this more in depth, but I am always curious about what prompts somebody to choose putting content under their pseudonym or not. My experience has always been quite sliding in terms of the criteria with which to evaluate that. And I'd love to know what other folks are using to make that decision.
Yeah. We do have a little bit of information about that.
Okay.
I don't know that we'll be able to suss out exactly the reasons why people choose a specific project, but we did definitely have some people talk to that. So I also asked, have you ever had more than one pseudonym? And of the people who have them, 44% said that yes, they have more than one. And about about 56% said nope, they just have the one. But yeah, I mean, we're really playing with numbers here, but like close to half, if you were to round up, a little less than half use more than one pseudonym, which to me probably speaks really to the branding. If you are trying to just separate,
I would say
the types of work that you do. So, and then this one was interesting to me. I was curious if they keep their pseudonym a secret from their readers or the general public. So this question assumed that they, even if they try to keep it private, that they make it so that producers and whatnot can find them to hire them. So not so secret that nobody knows about it, but just they don't make it public. And we had about 30% say that, yes, they do strive not to reveal their real name to readers. And so their pseudonym is separate from their real name publicly. We had another 33%, about a third, say that they don't advertise their pseudonym, but they don't really care if people find out who it is. So it's not a secret. It's just not something they advertise. And then about 19% said they actually make it known through like their website and social media that they are both people. I am this person, and I am also this pseudonym. And then about another 19% said that they have more than one pseudonym. Some they are tied to, and some they keep private.
Again, I have Gail's question about like what is the criteria that they're using to make these distinctions, and why be public with some pseudonyms and private with some. Like I know I've spoken with a couple of narrators for whom that's true, and I'm just so curious about like I've heard narrators talk about like, oh well, this is my other pseudonym, but this is then there's a person that I keep more private. I'm not going to reveal that. But I'm like, wow, really? Okay, then now I'm curious.
I do have a friend who has a pseudonym, loves doing romances under the pseudonym, and then got offered a book with some tropes that felt really beyond their comfort zone, created a new pseudonym in order to do that work. They wanted to work with the company, etc., but weren't sure if they wanted to be associated with the work.
Sure.
And so they set it up that way. The credits were written with this new pseudonym. And then they ended up recording the book, and they actually were surprised by how much they liked it, and the book did well, and they wished they had kept it under their main pseudonym. But that discomfort kind of with some of the tropes in the book initially did push them to do that.
Oh, that brings up this massive constant question, struggle, whatever that I have with all of this is we do our best when we sign on to something to assess that it's going to be right for us, that, but if you're working full time, it's difficult to deeply proofread everything before you sign a contract. And I've definitely run into obstacles around this before where I need to switch. I need to make a request to switch. This actually needs to go under this name. And I've also run into moments where it's been too late to make that switch and had to just accept that this is where I'm at. And I'm just curious what other people's journeys have been with that. Sometimes there's even things like you're talking about your friend, André. I don't have that pseudonym. I have this crosses those lines for me, and so I'm going to let it go. Mm-hmm. So then you find those things out later and have to be like, sorry, this doesn't fit under any of my identities. I can't do this. So I don't know. I'm just curious what other folks' experience with that has been.
Yeah, I've been on a journey with my pseudonym for sure. Because when I first pulled her out, and I use my pseudonym mostly for romance. It was when I was still working office day jobs, and I lost my previous job before the one when I started narrating pretty abruptly and had to get a new job. And I have a very Googleable name. So I'm the only Lindsey Dorcus in the world that I know of. So I was really nervous about potential employers, about corporate people Googling my name and finding like a sea of naked torsos, on Audible. And not legit. Because I felt any type of way, but I was worried about how that would be perceived by other people. And I was like, and if that messes with like my ability to earn a living or, whatever, pay my rent, I don't want to even worry about that. So anything that had even like a whiff of that, I tossed it under that pseudonym. And it's funny because now that I'm a full-time narrator, a lot of those books, like if they came to me now, I might do them under my name because I do romance and books with sex scenes and stuff under my name now because I'm not as worried about what some like faceless corporate recruiter might think of me. So it's interesting now looking back and being like, oh, that was a pseudonym book a few years ago and now it might be a Lindsey book. But also it's been useful now I put some books there purposefully, and also my pseudonym gets requested sometimes because she only does romance, and it's almost always like very explicit romance. So it's also, I think, helpful for listeners who like really want that genre. It's like you can search for my pseudonym and you're going to find more books like that. Whereas my like individual Lindsey is more diverse, but also now has like sexy books in there too. Because it was never something I felt like ashamed about personally or like that I, which is why like I'm one of those medium open with my pseudonym kind of people where I'm like, I don't announce it publicly all the time, but I'm like, when I'm talking to an author, I might be like, I have both these names. And if somebody's like, is this you? I'm like, it is. So it's not a secret. I do actually have one. I was nervous to talk about it, but we're on the Narrator Roundtable.
Yes!
I do have like a secret pseudonym that I will never tell to anybody. And I created it because I was in a similar situation to Andre's friend where I got offered a book. It was my first book from this publisher. And I've been trying to get in with them for like years and years and years. So I finally got a book offer from them. And it was a book that I really was not looking forward to narrating. It was self-help. But the author didn't have any big credentials. It was just like her talking about her experience in life and like applying that to like a self-help thing. And the more I read it, the more I was like, I really don't want to be connected with this in any way, but like, I feel like I have to do it if I want more books from this publisher. So I did it and I put it under a name that like will forever remain secret. And it's only that one book so far, but I do have it in the back of my head. I'm like, if I ever feel so, because right now it's more Gail's method where if I get something that I really don't want to do or doesn't feel like a fit for either me or my pseudonym, I say no. But if I ever do feel trapped again, I'm like, that secret pseudonym's out there. If I have to, I'll pull her out again.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing your secret shame.
Yeah.
That's what we're here for.
Yeah, I want to recognize something about shame too, because whatever it is that we navigate it as narrators, I don't think we're alone in it. I think readers also navigate it. I thought it was really interesting. Statista does all kinds of research. They did research in 2020 around books and genres. And they did a survey asking people what genres they read. And 27% of the respondents said they had read some kind of romance in the past year. 47 said they had read mystery, thriller, crime, right? Mystery, thriller, crime in around 2020 generated around $728 million in book sales. Romance generated almost $1.5 billion in book sales, right? And at the same time, like the top 10 Kindle rankings, 6 of them were some kind of romance or erotica genre. So that's to say, like, I think everybody is hiding something about their relationship.
Even when industry people talk about the genres that pay for everything else,
Yeah.
They will talk about sci-fi fantasy and they will talk about mystery thriller. And very few people, or at most, they will lump romance in with those other two, not acknowledging what you just said, which is that like romance is actually like twice as big as mystery thriller.
Romance readers are voracious, man. They're going through books that they're at a rate that is like inconceivable in my brain. Like, how do you listen to that many books in a day sometimes? Like, I know romance
2.5
listeners.
speed.
Yeah. They're listening to us be chipmunks and they're just devouring this shit.
And we will come back to the theme of shame, I think, a little bit.
Yeah.
I did want to move on to the reasons why some people reported in our survey why they chose to use a pseudonym. So of our 150 respondents, 130 responded to this question, meaning they have at least one pseudonym and had reasons for having it. I'm going to go through a few at the top. I will say a lot of people, we allowed folks to write in an answer, and we got a lot of write-ins, many of which probably fall under one of the more generic reasons we came up with, but they got more specific. So we have no way of knowing if they clicked both, if they are included in the, for example, like general privacy was the first one, and then a lot of people listed other things that were about privacy. So maybe these numbers are a bit off, but you can go look at the data yourself and you can look at the reasons that people wrote in. But general privacy was the first one, and 49 people, about 37%, said that's the reason why they have a pseudonym, just general privacy. Branding was number 2, and that was 57%. 75 people said it is a branding tool. Then we had I don't want family or friends to find some of what I narrate. 61 people, or 47%. So that's the reason they have a pseudonym. I would not feel safe being open about what I narrate where I live. Thankfully, this number was not as high as I expected it to be. It came in just under 8%, about 10 people. I narrate books with which I personally disagree, was similarly low, 10 people, 7.7%. I do not wish to have my name associated with some or all of the books I narrate, as we were talking about. Our secret shame. 56 people said, that's 43%, said that, yeah, I just don't want my name associated with this.
There's a moment for me in this, Kirt, where I have that kind of experience, and that you're saying like, oh, I didn't know, and I wasn't thinking initially when I took on this project that it was going to be something that I disagreed with so thoroughly. Only the first book was written, and I got partway through it and didn't think to say, hey, I'd like to do this book under a pseudo once I found out that the content was not as aligned with my own ideals or value systems. And there's a non-small part of me that really wishes I had put it under a pseudonym, and kind of still wishes I could. But that would mean rebranding for the author, and I'm not sure how that would work, But it's like I could definitely say, hey, this content is not at all in the mainstream of what I'm doing. But I've said that to her before, and she's just like, yeah, I don't really care. It's totally fine. I know you do mostly romance. It's really okay with me. And I'm like, oh, okay. And it's just like politically speaking, it's, her views are very libertarian and a little bit like on the anarchy side. And I'm like, cool. I totally feel like that's a relevant political perspective, but it's not my political perspective. And I really wish that I had done those books under a pseudo.
I'm curious, has anyone ever struggled, whether they're talking to a producer, but probably more likely like an indie author? Have you ever struggled with like presenting the idea of a pseudonym if you think it would fit better under that pseudo? Because sometimes I feel nervous about being like, hey, I'd love to do this book, but I'd like to put it under my romance pseudo, or I'd like to put it under, a pseudonym generally, because it doesn't fit with like my personal branding or what I'm trying to go for. But like, I feel like that's a tricky thing to do without, because you don't want to hurt their feelings or make them think like, oh, my book isn't your brand. which is also why like I feel like the branding like umbrella is both like helpful and mostly true, right? Like when I'm saying like I think this would work better under my romance name, it's not just because I don't know that it's like a Lindsey book, it's also because I'm like I think that your listeners will find it more easily now.
Right.
Yeah.
But
I think that's it.
I think that's super legit.
I think that's tricky too, though, when you're like trying to establish a pseudonym for the first time, especially if you didn't start with one.
Well, and that's part of the reason I probably wouldn't try to have a pseudonym now, because all of my books are so much under my main brand. But there's also like my brand is my brand because I was doing sex and relationship coaching before this, and it was a natural slide for me. It was a lateral move. You know, it was like it felt very much like I'm already talking about sex all the time. I'm already like into everybody's like, you know, personal business, and like people come to me because they know I'm a safe space for that. So it's like it is normal for me to discuss my friends' sex lives and mine with, you know, everybody in the world. And like that's sort of where I came from with the brand that I already had under my actual name, Lessa Lamb. And when I was doing coaching, I was using my actual name. I never had a pseudonym for that, even though it might have been advisable. But most of the coaches, like spirituality or business or life coaches I know, are using their actual name as a brand. And that seems like a natural offshoot for me. Plus, I think my name is really cute. You know, I actually really like it.
It is.
It's really cute. But then I was worried, actually. So my name now, Lessa Lamb, is post my first divorce. I actually took the name of my family, my mom's family. So my mother's maiden name. And that was what I moved forward with in my life because it felt more me. I was very close with my maternal grandparents when I was growing up. And that's sort of like where I felt like it was, I was most me. I didn't want to take back my my maiden name because I wasn't really attached to the person that it was attached to, which was my biological father. So it was just like, this doesn't fit for me anymore. I want to be a different person going forward. Like this feels more like me. So I use Lessa Lamb now and I love it. And then like going forward with that, I was concerned when I first took that name that it would be too cute, you know, like that this like, oh, Lessa had a little lamb, you know, like I'm this adorable little, no, I curse way too much for that shit, you know, like it's, I'm like a loudmouth broad. Like I was honestly worried that people would get the wrong impression about me with this like really cute name, but now it is who I am and fuck them if they don't get it.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. I mean, that feeling of personal identity is also, it's such a cool opportunity, sort of like with the drag names.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
It is odd that more industries where you have a public facing element don't do that. Like coaching, you use your real name. It's just hasn't made its way there yet, but you never know, it might. I want to touch on one more reason because we actually touched on it already. Lindsey brought this up. One of the responses was some of what I narrate could prevent me from keeping or getting a job in my chosen field. And about 24% of people said that was the reason why they had a pseudonym. And that was like, that's also like along the lines of what I was thinking before I knew I could do a pseudonym. And I know I've told this on this podcast before, but like I got to that first sex scene in that first book and like stopped, asked myself, do I ever want to be in politics? Said no. And proceeded with the sex scene because it was like I knew at that point
real
that it was like the words that are about to come out of my mouth will exist forever, and they would be so good in a political ad against to scare people
or for you.
And this was like 8 years ago when people were a lot more scared of gay sex than they are now.
Sure.
But yeah, so it's one of those that was the only thing that crossed my mind that I was worried about was like, could this have some consequences for me down the line, career or aspirational wise.
And I think it's worth saying too that I feel like a pseudonym is a nice like dodge and weave measure around that for sure, but it is not a bulletproof vest against that sort of thing. Like, and I knew when I started doing romance books under my pseudo while I was still holding down a corporate job, I was like, it doesn't take that much digging. If somebody really wanted to find it, they could. And it would be like just a few clicks down. I was mostly concerned about like just the initial Google, just the surface. Like it'll protect you from that probably. Although not even that sometimes. Sometimes like you get linked on one site or another and all of a sudden like those names are,
There
or you search for your name on Audible and all of your pseudonym books also come up because, Audible's like, it seems like people buy books from this narrator too. Like, so I think that's also important to consider if you're thinking about a pseudonym. It might help, but it's not going to like, if you really are like, I can never have anyone hear this, then maybe just don't narrate it.
Maybe just bounce. Yeah.
I also felt, I think a lot of people felt and had the conversation about too, like what my personal limitations would be in terms of if someone finds out this is me, what is it that I like want to or don't want to navigate in terms of that conversation. And I, for a long time, didn't have a pseudonym. I didn't have a pseudonym for the first probably 2/3 of my narrating career. I think I was almost 100 books in before I started narrating under my pseudonym. And I didn't feel like I ever wanted to have a space online, like a social media presence where I exclusively went by my pseudonym and interacted with people as my pseudonym, or like the ways that I liked being on social media didn't feel like they were possible with a pseudonym. They didn't feel like that would have been like the approach that would have brought me joy, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm curious. We've touched on this a little bit, but I'm curious if anyone else has any more stories or moments when they went, because we've talked about why people choose. If you've been like, ooh, I wish I had a pseudonym, or like, I wish I could go back and use a pseudonym, or I wish I could go back and like not use one.
I just sort of wish I had one from the very beginning, because while I've been very fortunate so far to not have any serious consequences of it, the reality is somebody can look up my name and find where I live. Like, it's my real legal name. It's tied to legal documents. It's out there. Like, if somebody really wanted to, they can find me because I used my real name. And like Lindsey, it's a very unique name. Because of the way I spell Kirt, it is not hard to find me. If you Google me, you're going to get me.
But also, if you make a comment on the wrong TikTok account, they can find where you live too. You know what I mean? Like, that's a whole brand. Yes. I also think like there's an entire vein of trust and mistrust anyways online about people's information and privacies and the consequences of things that happen in digital spaces and whether or not we should take them away from those digital spaces. But
but I'm not concerned so much about digital spaces. My concern is
physical spaces,
especially narrating erotica and romance. That lends itself to, and we talked about this on a previous episode of the Narrator Roundtable. Go listen to Sean Krisden's episode. It can create a false sense of intimacy, and that can lead people to try to cross some boundaries.
What's interesting to me about this is that I've been hearing and discussing this with a number of narrators and people in the industry, and it's fascinating to me that it's a little bit gender role reversed in audiobooks specifically, because while it feels like almost normal in the actual default world for women to be highly persecuted in sexual circumstances or situations like that, like I feel like in a normal everyday context, like if I were in pornography, or like if I were doing like visual pornography, because a lot of people consider audiobooks that have romance to be pornography also, which were real. But if I were doing a different kind of sex work, essentially, and in my coaching work, this was a thing that came up for me, and I had a PO box that I used with all of my email communications and all that kind of stuff, that I am not actually as concerned about it as a female-bodied person, and as a female-oriented person in audiobooks specifically, because so much of our demographic is either AFAB straight women. AFAB, for those of who don't know, assigned female at birth, women who are raised women or cisgendered women, who are monogamous and heterosexual, and like that's the vast majority of our listenership. Like that is almost like, I don't know, like something like 70 or 80%. Like it's crazy. And then like another like of the last 20%, you know, like 15 of that is like probably gay men. And it's there's just like such a narrow window of the people that I would be worried about, quote unquote, worried about, like trying to come and find me or stalking me or whatever, that even listen to audiobooks at all. And like, or listen to the genre of audiobooks that I would be concerned about them creating that false intimacy with. And like, for me, I go to conventions or I go to events and things like that, and people meet me, and I'm so excited about it because it's all these amazing women who are just like, oh my God, I loved when you did this and that. And the squirting scene in Strings is so hilarious. And I'm like, yeah, it really is. So I'm not worried about that. But for the male, especially like the cisgendered, straight, monogamous male people I see in our scene, in our industry, that go to these conventions, there are some who are very, very, very cautious about their identity and having their identity out in the world. And that is real. And I have seen it in action because some of the women in this world, like, ladies, cut it out, man. Like these are not, they're your book boyfriends only, right? You don't actually know this person. And I have seen women do some pretty fucked up shit in public spaces, like social media and like, you know, like even in person at cons, where it's just like your masculine male body is like my object of objectification, you know, like it's okay for me to say things about how I orient to you in my attraction or arousal or things like that. And that's just like not actually true. It is not appropriate to do that. You do not have consent from that person just because they said sexy things on an audiobook. Like, and that's what surprises me most, I think, is that I think that there's some like cultural normative situations here where it's like men are persecuted for that kind of stuff in spaces where they're talking about women, but it's not in the reverse. With women, it's so much less threatening. It's almost like cute. But when you are that male-bodied person, and I've heard this from male-bodied people in our industry who've had these experiences, it is absolutely threatening. It is not okay. It's deeply disturbing, and it really is traumatizing for people. So that's something that I really feel is relevant to this conversation about pseudonyms, because especially if you are a male-bodied person, especially in our culture where it's like that's not normal, or we're not like culturally prepared for it as male-bodied people, but like female-bodied people are like ready for that kind of shit, which is fucked up in its own right. But I do think that that's a huge piece of the conversation and is really relevant.
Well, speaking of romance, we did ask for those people who do narrate under their real name and a pseudonym, what types of content do you use your real name for? And I will say it's pretty even across the board, with some exceptions. The only things to pull under 40% of the genres that we provided were romance, erotica. Erotica was only 7.6%. Only 9 people said they've ever narrated erotica under their own name of all our respondents. And the other one that came in just under 40%, politics.
Oh, yep.
Everything else was north of 50% that they spread out through the genres, whether they use their real name or not.
Yeah.
But romance, politics, and erotica, people don't touch it with their real names. And this is where I'm going to introduce my thesis for this episode, which was that as much as we have come to find reasons why having a pseudonym can be important, such as general privacy, and like that it can be useful in branding, and we've even seen, I know at least 2 people in male-male romance who have retroactively rebranded to have a little bit of separation between their real name and a romance persona, or one that's for more dark or heavy material. Even though we've come to these other reasons and we've seen there's other advantages, I believe that a lot of the reasons pseudonyms exist is that we as a culture are still really uncomfortable with sex and sexuality. Would anybody else like to co-sign or disagree with me on that?
Hear, hear.
Yeah. Well, also interesting, I mean, because a pattern that we see more broadly in entertainment is like, I don't see horror on that list. I don't see like thrillers where somebody might get murdered. Like we don't treat violence the same way.
Yeah, violence is okay, but sex is not. Yeah, real.
We also, I feel like there is, and I am terrible at defining the distinction, but even in terms of publishing and the branding of different kinds of books, I do feel like there is the New York Times romance, and then there's like the paperback shirtless torso romance.
Yeah,
and I think there's a divide there. And I'll recognize like my own, like I have romance books that I'll do under my name, and then less spicy books that feel more like they're like related to the type of romance that my pseudonym is doing. Right. But it does feel like there is that divide. And it's not explicitly a content divide, because you'll get a literary fiction that'll have the most detailed sex scene you've ever read in your entire life. And that's a top of the shelf, not top of the shelf, you know what I mean? Like front of the
You're proud to put your name on it.
You know, when you put a book on the top of the shelf, that means it's a good book.
Yeah, like a bar.
My bookshelf's organized. But that also does bring up this question of like, you know, we are actors. Like these words we're speaking are not our opinions, our feel, like you say, Lindsey. We are not murderers if we're playing one in a horror book, like hopefully. But
wow.
But like, you know, the politics statistic there to me implies that folks are not wanting to put their name on something that doesn't align with their own political beliefs, which then does fall into this, you know, so like there's this, again, sort of not very clear divider between how we own the work that we take on or don't, or something in between. And that's what is really interesting to me about that statistic. And then you're right. It's like we are magnified in how we do or do not own our own sexuality in a public space in a way that we're not for other parts of who we are and how we walk through the world. And I think it's very interesting.
Actually, you know, that is interesting, because for me, I feel like that divide is really clear in terms of like why I would never narrate a nonfiction political book that I disagreed with, if I could help it. And why and why I say no to like certain books that I say no to based on content and not like scheduling or something. And for me, that line is always, personally, do I think that this book could cause harm? And, you know, and I know that that's like kind of, I mean, everyone's definition is different. And of course, you could get real into the nitty gritty of like, oh, well, reading this like really graphic sex scene could be triggering for somebody. But I'm not talking about like individual level. I think our voices are powerful. I think our voices are amplifying the stories we're telling. And I think when you're in a fictional world where someone's getting murdered or whatever, like I would think and hope that like people understand that that's fiction, and that the purpose of that story is catharsis or is entertainment or whatever. Whereas something that's not putting out a point of view, nonfiction, or even using fiction to like push a harmful point of view. That's personally when I am like reading a manuscript or skimming through a manuscript to say like, do I feel comfortable doing this? That's what I'm looking for. I'm like, is my voice amplifying these words going to cause real world harm?
Thank you for stating that way. I think that helps me clarify where my lines are, that my name proudly stands with the artistic statement, creative statement that's being made, human journey that's being explored. My pseudonym takes on ones that I feel fine about but have no strong opinion, and I don't take on the ones that feel harmful. And that's really helpful to have that clarity, because I've never been able to really identify what is separating it from what, except that it's like instinctual. But that's it.
Right. Well, it's like, is somebody gonna, if this book is like anti-trans, for example, is somebody gonna listen to this book, read this book, and then go out into their community and like cause real harm, or try to get a book ban passed, or like treat their child worse or whatever? You know, like that's sort of what I'm thinking about when I say like, does this cause harm? And that's why like things like politics, which have such real world ramifications. Yeah. Whereas I'm like, if somebody's listening to, a murder mystery, I don't think that person is inclined to be like, well, time to do a murder in my community. I don't think anybody's approaching those stories with that sort of viewpoint. They're seeing it as entertainment or as, a fun story that makes them think about like other things in their life apart from murder.
So that is actually the main reason that I wish I had done those books that I was talking about previously, because book 3 actually has a big section where one of the characters that becomes one of the primary characters that the book is following is gay, and they end up at a drag bar, and the political climate is such that a lot of people are doing crime because they have no other option. But this person ends up being like a criminal and actually ends up killing somebody, but doesn't gets involved with someone's murder, and that is not what they had intended. And then it's this whole downward spiral of it feels like it's linked to their sexuality and the gender orientations of the people involved in the story. And again, book 3 was not written when I started this series. Book 2 wasn't even written when I started the series, and I had no way of knowing. And it's one of the things that now when I'm starting series that are unwritten, or I'm involved in the process of a series that's being created sort of as we speak, and then my co-narrator and I are in on the ground floor of it, and we're getting a lot of of the behind the scenes of creating this world, and it's a fantasy world, and it's really fascinating. But one of the things that I needed to clarify in that, these books are not written yet. I need to make sure that the content is not going to be something that I am so thoroughly misaligned with. I want to use my actual name for this. Do I need to create a pseudo for it? Is this going to be something that I suddenly disagree with? And the authors involved, I feel confident that nothing like that is going to happen, especially with regard to LGBTQIA plus kind of stuff, because that is a serious platform for me. And that's one of the reasons that this book series that I did, I'm really, really crunchy about it. And because it's just not at all my ethos or my value system. And I feel concerned that it may cause harm in the exact way that Lindsey was talking about. It terrifies me, honestly.
Yeah. And like you said, we can't always anticipate or know, or sometimes this stuff surprises us, and we're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. So this is not me passing judgment on you or anybody too,
of course,
but just how I approach it when I have the chance to review something. But it's so tricky to navigate. Absolutely.
There are so many real questions about who we are as artists to the art that we are participating in. I think we're talking a lot about the moral, internal questions. Also, like Lindsey, you said, these political, systematic questions, throw back to that Systemic Power episode 1, season 1. But I do also feel there is still a lot to be explored. It's a notable legal problem right now that there is currently a rapper in, I think a Atlanta or a Georgia court where his rap lyrics are being used in the case, which is a big legal problem. And it was notable to me, Kirt, how many people had stepped aside from the options you offered in the survey to specify I was worried that people involved in this project were going to be sued, and that I was going to be sued as part of this. And I think I'm sure in most cases there's not an issue. There's reasonable distance. And it seems there are also some questions left out in the world about our role in this, ideally art, whatever it is, but also that art is not substanceless in the same way that we can say I hope my book reaches someone. I hope it connects with them and brings them joy and helps them find their path. There are also other implications to the stuff that we participate in a variety of ways. And I'm also curious if we're talking about shame, and we're talking about these other reasons that we navigate pseudonyms. And I'm curious, Lessa, you talked about this. You were talking about listeners, and this kind of I guess it's essentially these parasocial relationships, right? That's my best framework.
Absolutely.
And I am so curious about all the ways that those exist and how they impact us too. I also feel like I think romance books, like boy bands, like there are a lot of spaces where the parasocial relationships particularly are for women or for girls. Men have their own spaces. I have watched armies of men take football posts off the field and throw them into a river. Why do that? Whole thing. I'm really curious, I guess, about all the things that are specific to audiobooks versus all the things that are just about the ways that consumers have learned to participate in consumption.
And that sort of brings up a little bit of what Lindsey was talking about with the difference between sex and sexuality being censored or taboo or shame-filled and violence not. You know, like that sort of the way that we've been culturally programmed to sort of like seek those spaces where we can, I don't know, it's almost like video games, or, you know, like a lot of people have been talking about this with video games or content where we're like first person shooters, where we're like doing a bunch of violence in video games. And does that actually create a scenario where we're desensitized to violence in the real world, or does it give us a positive outlet for expressing those feelings? So it's like, it's a both and, in my opinion. Yes, sometimes it's going to be some desensitization. I mean, like I was just watching Ender's Game again with a friend of mine, and we were discussing sort of the theory of this kind of like video game versus real life versus like you know, as people are like flying drones, or we're doing like different kinds of like, we are not as involved physiologically or our personal bodies or livelihoods or lives are not being put on the line in the same way in warfare even, you know, where we're like actually not in those spaces. But like, if it comes down to it, what are we doing psychologically that makes those kinds of things okay and these other kinds of things not okay? You know, like this kind of violence is like, you know, oh, it's not okay to solve your problems with violence. But really, is it? Because now we, you know, a lot of us really associate deeply with like vigilante justice in media, you know, where we're like, oh yeah, we want that person who did bad, who the law is not going to persecute properly. We want them to get theirs, you know, and like that's a lot of even the stories that we tell in our narration work. Like a lot of the dark romance is about that kind of thing.
Absolutely.
Like almost all of the dark romance I've done is about vigilante justice. And like that's a huge, huge part of it where we're like, we want justice done because our system is broken.
Yeah.
Because we can't get this outlet, because we don't see justice being done in the real world. Is that something similar with the fear, shame, and guilt around sexuality? Is it because we can't express this authentically in our actual lives that we lean on this romance trope, the genres and subgenres that we see in romance? Is this how we are able to feel seen in our sexuality in a way? And this is funny. Kirt, I was wondering if this pseudonym conversation, if the reason you brought me in for this conversation, you said you had a secret hidden agenda for having me be this person, but was because of the work that I did in my sex and relationship coaching, because that was so much of what I was doing there. Cool. Yeah.
I mean, that was, I wanted your perspective as somebody who has dived into these issues outside of the world of audiobooks.
Yes.
To speak to, you know, like how many of the clients that you worked with was part of the issue, just like working through some shame related to sex and sexuality, because
almost
of the way that we're all
one.
raised and the society we live in. You know, like I'm not saying it's anybody's individual fault.
No, it is a function of the culture and the society that we're raised in. It's a function of, I think, especially in the U.S. or in Western culture, this sort of puritanical ideals, or, you know, a lot of the, like, you know, one would say even in like, we think of that as a U.S. thing, like the puritanical culture, because the Puritans came here to escape, you know, like persecution of their religious blah, blah, blah. But even in Europe, even in England, and in a lot of the European culture that the Puritans were escaping from, was still extremely like straight-laced. You know, you look at like Victorian England or Elizabethan England, and it's like, ooh, there's an ankle involved. Ooh, you know, it's about shaming specifically women's sexuality, specifically.
Yeah, I was going to
women's
bring that up.
bodies.
Like
Absolutely.
the demographic stats
Yep.
you presented earlier, you cannot ignore who this content is being made for and who it's being made by, and that those people are the people who are not allowed to feel these feelings or express these parts of themselves.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And even seeing that reflected in the number of women, 75% saying that they were using a pseudonym versus just 60% for men.
And so I did an entire early on in my coaching work, I did a summit, an online summit where I did a bunch of interviews with a bunch of different sexperts. I love that word, by the way, sexpert.
Yeah,
It makes me smile. It makes me internally so glow. I love it so much. But I interviewed 20 different people on this, and the thing that came up in almost every single interview, and the thing that came up in almost every single client I worked with, and almost every single client they worked with, fear, shame, and guilt. That is the top 3 reason. And the first summit that I did was about communicating in sexuality, and the reason that people don't communicate their needs or communicate more transparently or say what it is that feels good to them or doesn't feel good to them, or have a conversation even getting into sexuality with partners, or even with partners they've been established with for years and years and years and years and years. They don't talk about it because fear, shame, guilt. One of those 3 things is the prominent thing. And if fear is at the top of it, then shame and guilt are close seconds. If shame is at the top of it, then fear and guilt are close seconds. It's those 3 things can boil down to every single reason people do not advocate for their own needs and sexuality.
And sort of like what Lindsey was saying, if it's not your own fear, shame, or guilt, you have to worry about what other people might bring to the table.
Absolutely.
How other people might judge your, which I guess is a fear, but
well, sure.
Even the most progressive and sexually liberated of us still have to think about, well, how will this be perceived by someone else?
Yes.
Will this hurt my chances of working? I was a high school forensics coach for many years.
Oh, wow.
Will this work prevent me from getting another job where I work with teenagers if somebody finds this? Was something I had to think about. And if I was okay with defending the work I was doing, if anybody decided to make an issue out of it,
It's so interesting that you bring that up too, because you were saying something about the very first sex scene you narrated. You're like, stop. Do I ever want to get into politics? No. Move forward, So listening to you describe that moment, and then Lindsey said something about will it hurt you or will it not? Will it actually help you there? And I was like, that, because my platform eventually became, even in my coaching work, and especially in my coaching work, honestly, was that and this is why I did away with my business Facebook page, because I was just I don't care. Not that I don't care, but it's actually important to me to be transparently me in every aspect and every facet of my life. This is who I am. If I ever do decide to do something political, which I don't know if I have the stomach for it, but I kind of would almost want to in a way, because I'd love to see this represented transparently in the political spectrum. But that if I did choose that, I would almost be more glad that I had never decided to use a pseudonym, because I would want to say, look, this is who I am. This is okay. And there is all this spectrum in how we can do ourselves in the world. And why do we continue to shame this? The baseline here is not transparency, it's consent. It is authentic opt-in of whoever is consuming the material, and it is knowing what you're getting into and having the cognitive capacity and age-related, age-appropriate decision-making ability to authentically consent to what's going on. And that's why I think it's so important that a lot of the books that we're narrating, a lot of the things that we're doing have age-appropriate kinds of things. Because I'll do teen romance. I will. But it has to be age appropriate. I'm not going to do statutory teen romance, I'm not going to do a 25-year-old with a 16-year-old. That's not okay with me. That's baseline. That there's grooming books out there. And I'm just this is not my genre. This is not going to be okay with me. Cool. They become adults. They're 18 to 25, then they go and especially if the younger character is pursuing the older character, even when the gender roles are, not what you would consider grooming, usually it's a younger female character and an older male character. But even if it's not, then I will do something like that as long as they're adults, They have, developed the brain capacity and the cognitive ability to do these behaviors consensually, etc. That's what the bottom line becomes for me. And that's a lot of where I see that sort of fear, shame, guilt, and the taboo tropes that we get into as both narrators and the writers that I speak with as well say. It is so critical for us to be representing these things that are so taboo and so looked down upon and shamed in our culture, because it creates the thing we most want to not create. It makes it more like exciting or titillating in a lot of ways. And then people move toward that stuff because they're not supposed to. It's oppositional defiance disorder stuff, like it's that, but all the way down. So like, what are we promoting? But also, what are we stigmatizing that is then actually going to drive people to it more?
It'd be interesting in a conversation about fear and like how it could hurt you in a business setting, like how it might hurt us in our own business setting. I think I've talked to a lot of narrators who feel that if they don't use a pseudonym for certain types of work, that it will prevent them from getting work outside of romance and erotica. And I mean, if we were to do another poll, I would love to survey people who hire narrators to see if that is something they even look at. Like, if you're casting, like, sure. Do you care? Like, if you go to somebody's Audible page and you see a bunch of shirtless men, will you go, then I don't think they're right for this YA book? Like, does that even come into it? I would love to know it. I know that fear exists for many of us.
I'll just say I don't have that problem. Like, that's not. I don't know. It's not stopping me. It hasn't stopped anyone yet. So
yeah, I've gotten some YA work, and
yeah, you do that too. Yeah,
doesn't seem to.
Yeah.
So I mean, but again, that's anecdotal. It doesn't disprove it. But I would, if we were to do another survey on the subject, I'd actually love to hear from the other perspective.
Yes.
Like, for the people who are hiring us, do they care?
Yeah.
Do they mind if we
really
use a pseudonym
question.
for a certain book? If they reached out to Gail and said, we'd really love for you to do this book, and Gail prepped it and came back with, I'd actually like to do it under my pseudonym, like, do they care?
Yeah.
Or are we making this into something much bigger than
that's a really
than it
question.
Needs to be?
It's interesting that you say it like that too, though, because that's another angle of the branding thing, not just branding for listeners and authors, but I also use it as branding for publishers, because I know I've run into the issue of like, and this is part fear and part reality of like, once they learn that like I do a certain type of romance, they're going to be like, oh, well, we got bushels of that. Here you go. Yeah. Like, we're just going to feed you that forever. And it got to the point where I had to be like, okay, I only do X number of romance titles a month. Sometimes I break from that, but I try to keep it like, so I can leave slots open for other genres. And also I feel like that's part of the reason for the pseudonym is being like, cool, you have like this fun hetero romance, like awesome. My pseudo will do it. I will put my whole self into it. I will do a couple of those every month and it will be so fun. But also Lindsey, this person would love these other genres, queer romance or thriller or horror. Like, and I feel, I don't know how much is really affecting casting people's brains, but I'm hoping that like by putting them in two separate buckets, I'm like, you've put so much in this bucket. Thank you. This bucket now?
Yeah.
Can we get a little balance here? Yeah.
I just like variety. I just like some variety in my life.
Is the spice?
Yeah. I feel like this is really one of those conversations that could go on and on for hours. But as with many conversations here at the Narrator Roundtable, I hope this is the beginning of a lot more conversations happening out in the real world, not just in our little bubble. And I am sure there are many perspectives that we did not hit on that I hope folks will reach out to us to talk about. And again, listeners, feel free to take a look at the actual information, the survey that will be linked in the show notes. If your podcast app does not allow you to click on links in show notes, you can go to our website, and we will also have the information there for you. Thank you guys so much for coming on and chatting about this with me. It's something that I've been thinking about like since we started the podcast, and it was so much fun to finally get to have this conversation. Thank you so much, Lessa, for joining us to bring your particular perspective, which was really valuable in so many ways, not just because of your past career. And also thank you to everybody who filled out the survey
Yes.
Your input really helped me understand more about this topic, and it challenged many of my assumptions. So thank you to everybody who took the time to fill that out. It was really wonderful. And listeners, we thank you for joining us at the Narrator Roundtable. If you would like to join the conversation, you can find us on social media, or you can visit our website, narratorroundtable.com, to submit a question or a topic of discussion for a future episode. We would like to know what's on your mind, because we will talk about it.
The Narrator Roundtable is produced and hosted by André Santana, Deanna Anthony, Gail Shalan, Kirt Graves, and Lindsey Dorcus. All copyrighted material is shared with permission. Music and sound effects are licensed through Storyblocks Audio. All opinions shared are those of the individuals and do not reflect the positions or policies of any company or organization with which they happen to be associated.